I'm on a roll today. I figured I might as well do another episode today. And this is something that I have been thinking about doing for a while, a couple of months. Because for a while I was actually one of these people, for the most part. I had other ideas as well that I was also into, but for the most part, I was, for a little while, I was actually into this idea that I'm going to be talking about, which is why I'm going to be talking about it. And I might actually make another video today after this one. Something that I've been trying to practice more, especially nowadays, because the problem nowadays is that so many people are so emotional. All these riots in Portland and all these other places. You don't really see nuance. You don't really see a whole lot of thinking about your thinking. So I might do another video about that, but this episode is going to be called "What We Can Learn from Libertarianism." And in this episode, I'm going to be talking about the flaws of libertarianism and anarcho-capitalism, in particular, really. Although libertarianism as well is also kind of flawed in some ways, but there's also a lot of accurate things that they point out about things that I think should be pointed out, because libertarianism isn't really seen very accurately, or isn't seen at all. And so I think it's a good idea to, this is one of the reasons why I recommend to expand your understandings of things. Expand, look more at what you don't like, what you don't believe, and try and entertain the ideas, at least at first, until you look at them enough to where you can be critical of them. Which I'm going to make a video about next, probably. So this episode is going to be about what we can learn from libertarianism. So the first one is kind of obvious. The first one is obvious to those who are libertarians, I suppose. And it has to do with something they call, this might be an anarcho-capitalist thing, something they call the non-aggression principle. Which basically is do no harm to others unless they're doing harm to you. And they claim, and they're sort of right, that the government violates this principle because they will do harm to you if you don't pay taxes, and they will do harm to you if you do things that aren't necessarily violent crimes, and don't necessarily hurt anyone at all, except maybe yourself, and even yourself. So that's the main point, actually. There's some other points where I'm going to get into as well, but that's really the main thrust of this episode. So I think this is actually really important. Where I think they're wrong on this is that they think that people, that taxation is basically theft, and in kind of sense it is, but it's a theft for a purpose. So it's not really theft so much as it is a trade for services rendered, basically. You may not realize this, but the government offers all these different things. You have public utilities like electric. If we had private electric companies, which we do have, but for the most part it's a public utility for a reason. But if we had these private electric companies, how much do you think they'd charge? Especially if they were the only ones in the area. That's one of the problems that I have with libertarianism, is that they're like, well, if there's an area where you have a businessman who's whatever, then somebody else will come in there and create competition. And for most businesses, that's probably going to be true. But for things that require a lot of capital, a lot of money, and especially for places who don't really have a lot of, these resources like in cities, it's not going to be true. You're not going to find somebody who's going to be able to just create an electric company out of nowhere. It's not going to happen. And they can. Another thing that libertarians say is that, because people argue that if you get rid of taxation, you'll have no police. And one of their arguments is that, well, you don't really need police. You need security guards and things like this. But there's this thing called the Pinkerton Agency, back in the 1890s, I think it was, who wasn't really beholden to anybody, not a government or anything, and they weren't exactly for the people. I believe they were working for corporations. You had these types of things happen. So in a sense they're right, but in a sense they're wrong. This is what I mean by nuanced thinking, that you have to look at all these different ideas and go, well, here's where there's something that's correct, and here's where something is wrong. Because otherwise you're gonna go with what's normal, what's obvious, which is what I call black and white thinking, where you just have one position. You're either this or you're that. You're either with us or against us. This type of thing. So, the non-aggression principle, for the most part, is correct. And it's one of the main things that the government ignores, because, and there's a point that they make, which I think is actually pretty accurate. That's pretty much, I'm going to be butchering this, but that because the government isn't really beholden to people, for the most part. I mean, you have elections and things like this, but because the government doesn't really have to, listen to us. They really don't. And they don't listen to us anyways. But because they don't really have, to do this, they don't care. They'll violate the non-aggression principle. They'll violate your civil rights. Just give them an opportunity, and you'll celebrate it, because you'll think there's a threat called terrorism that doesn't really exist. I might do an episode about that, because it's really one of the problems that we have. We have these problems that end up being overblown and over hyped over many years. One of them is terrorism, and the only case of terrorism that I know of was 9/11. The other types of terrorism are happening in these Middle East countries, and they've increased since we've been in those countries. So there's that to consider. So I mostly agree. We should not be in these countries for obvious reasons. Another problem that has to do with them, not really the libertarians, but this idea of going to war with these countries, is this illusion of a savior complex that people have, which caused a lot of problems. I think that's one of the reasons why people wanted to get rid of Saddam and Gaddafi. But what they don't understand is why these people almost had to be there, because people don't understand what spiral dynamics is, and because they don't really know what it is or understand it, they think that these people are bad, these people should be toppled out of their place of power, but they don't understand what level these people are on. Give an example, and then I'll go back into what I'm talking about with libertarianism. So you have somebody like Saddam Hussein, who sure committed some crimes, some awful crimes, but you got to think of the place that he was in, the culture that he was dealing with. A very stage-read and possibly purple, and a little bit and some blue culture. So, if you don't know that much about spiral dynamics, I recommend you read into it. You watch some videos about it. There's a couple of videos on spiral dynamics. One of them is by a channel called Aaron Dowdy. One of them is by a channel called actualize.org. There's about 4 of them that are from actualize.org. They go into stage blue. But these places like Iraq are pretty red, which basically, you don't really have the same ideals that we do in in the United States and in other places in the West, which mostly is like orange and green and blue, which is maybe higher up in the stages, but this keeps you from looking at these other stages, like stage red. You see stage red and you see it's like evil and bad and should be gotten rid of, but you don't understand that this is not how this works. You can't just wish it away like it doesn't exist. It doesn't work this way. So back to libertarianism. So getting rid of these other this warlike situation, we're pretty much beyond this, but because we have a government that doesn't really have transparency, doesn't really have a lot of these things that we should have as a government. Norway is more transparent than I think most countries, as far as I can tell. Just a side note, Norway is probably, I think, more transparent than most Western countries, and especially including us. We're probably like the least transparent of Western countries, as far as I know. But let's track of so transparency. So in a sense, they're also right about taxation. It's theft in a sense. I'm not saying that taxation is theft. What I'm saying is that because we don't have a choice to what our taxes go to, we are in a sense being thieved. We're being conned. Basically, what I'm telling you is that we should have a choice in what our taxes go to. At least 20% of them. And that was his idea that was proposed. I don't know if it was his idea or not, but it was an episode. Well, there's 4 episodes in this series that he did. But this episode was called Conscious Politics, where he goes into one of the ideas that he proposed, which I really liked. It's really a cool idea, was that you have control over what 20% of your taxes go to, and that every year you get like a report, and what this report shows you is what these agencies that you gave taxes to did, and what they didn't do. How transparent they were, how effective they were, and so you could change that every year, depending on how good or bad the agencies you gave money to did. I think that's a really good idea. I think that's a start. So that's part of it as well. So the problem that I have with them as well is that they don't understand what culture is, why culture is. And because they don't understand why culture is, they think that because we can just get rid of government and it'll fix all these problems. But that's not really how this works. Because, well, number one, government gives us a lot of things that if we didn't have, the government, a lot of these problems would get worse that we have. Number 2 is that if we get rid of government, we'll have something called absolute freedom, which they think is a great thing. But I put it to you this way. If we all had absolute freedom, that means that I could go into your house and murder you and your children and take your women from my own. That's what absolute freedom is. Sure, you could hire security guards, but what would we have then? We'd have a bunch of warlords with a bunch of security guards that we wouldn't necessarily even control. They'd basically be mercenaries, because security guards are basically getting money to be mercenaries. Because they can you can double their money, and you could get some of them to double cross. I mean, not all of them would, but some of them would, especially if they get bigger payouts or they get promises. You could double their money, and they could double cross who they're being hired by. And their argument to that would be, well, if we have competition with security guards and we have all these things, it would stop a lot of that from happening. But it wouldn't, because you got to think of it this way: when you have corporations with billions, trillions even of dollars, hundreds of billions of dollars, and then you have somebody like us who really doesn't have that much money, and first of all is probably working for these corporations. Who do you think's got the bigger security guards? Who do you think has the bigger companies, or the bigger security guard companies working for them? It's not going to be us. It's going to be them. And then they can do pretty much whatever they want, because nobody's controlling them, because they have the control and the power. And we have no power, or very little power. I mean, sure, we can hire some security guards. We can do some things. But it wouldn't be enough, because they have most of the money for themselves. So they can just become dictatorships. The dictatorship of Google, the dictatorship of Apple, the dictatorship of Amazon, whatever it is. And then you have, these corporations then that are going to be basically like feudal lords, and we're going to be back in the Middle Ages again. So that's one of the big problems that I have with their system. What they're right about, for the most part, I think pretty much completely actually, is monopolies. That we have, it's not just about monopolies, corporate monopolies, which actually are kind of created by the government, which they point out, which is kind of correct, for the most part correct. But there's also government monopolies, which I agree with it. I don't think we should have any of these monopolies. They don't really fix the problem. But the problem is that if you have this total freedom that they think they want, they can have all the monopolies they want. Nobody's going to stop them. We're already reaching a point right now in this climate of politicalization where if you go against what the so-called mainstream wants, the mainstream media, whoever has the power, right now it's the far left at this point. So if you go against what they're saying and say that BLM has gone too far, you literally get fired right now. That's where we're at. That's the climate we're in right now. If you're going against, whatever it is, it has to do with the far left. You're gonna get fired. You're gonna get chastised. There was a poll, or I think it was a survey. And I'm not one for trusting polls for the most part, but I think this is pretty accurate. Actually, it makes sense. That showed that 62% of the public is afraid to speak their own opinions, and that the only people who are actually comfortable speaking their opinions is the far left. It's because they're the only ones that are Well, I wouldn't say all of them, but many of the more violent ones are causing this ideology to be spread. They have the power because people just keep bending the knee to these people. I don't think it would be any different with, libertarianism. There's nothing to stop these corporations from doing even worse. They could say, well, we could stop them with their wallets. Well, think of it this way. If you have a corporation that's got trillions of dollars to spend, or billions of dollars, let's just say a couple $100 billion to spend, and you have somebody, regular Joe Blow who has, several $100,000. I mean, I'm exaggerating, but I'm giving somebody who's, highly rich, or not really highly rich, but more rich than, the average person. If a government corporation, or a corporation that's not even controlled by government, but that had, if there's no government, says that you cannot say X, you will be fired if X happens. If you will be fired if you criticize libertarianism in this anarcho-capitalist system that we have set up. What is he going to do? Especially if he disagrees. What is he going to just speak out and get fired? I don't think so. They don't understand how survival works. They don't understand how the mind works. Most politicians don't. Most political people don't understand how the mind works. Why these things happen the way they happen. And for the most part, I can say that I was the same way for a long time. Even when I understood a lot about the mind, I didn't understand enough. I wasn't looking at the structure of the mind to see the problems of the mind. So this idea of freedom that the libertarians give you, like, oh, you could have no government and you'd be free. You'd have higher security guards. It'd be a utopia. Yeah, that's oversimplified thinking, for one. For two, there's serious problems with this idea. You're assuming that all the problems are caused by government. And I'd argue that many of them probably are, but not all of them. Because the mind, I'd actually argue that the problems are actually not the government at all. The problems are that the way the mind works. Because if the mind worked differently than it does now, our governments would be different, because we'd have different politicians who would be more ethical, more honorable, or whatever else. And so they would, they wouldn't be doing what they're doing now. I mean, there's so much more that I could go into about that, but I'll just leave it there for now. I just thought I'd make this interesting episode. So, anyways, this is Political Ideas and Thoughts, and I'll talk to you in the next one.